going to dive into cataloging for non-catalogers. And we're going to talk a little bit about what is cataloging, so what are we trying to do, and then I'm going to do a little bit of what I call alphabet soup. So just bear with me, but you're going to have the terminology, and hopefully you'll have a good understanding of what those terms mean. So when you go out and look at cataloging resources, you will go, aha, I remember that, or I know how to look it up. And then we're going to talk about MARC basics, because we are still in a MARC world, and we're going to talk about what that means because it is a challenge for everybody. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how to identify what you have, and then how do you determine whether or not it's a good match. Now, in terms of how to identify whether or not it's a good match, I have a really great resource guide. It's like a little kind of checklist you can go through, and I will put that in the resources folder. You will get links to, you'll get the PowerPoint presentation, you're going to get the resources handout, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in that resources folder. So there's some exercises for you to do. I'm putting together some more resources, and I'm pulling together some of those other things like my checklist for how to identify a good record. In terms of part 2, which will be coming up in just a couple of weeks after this one, we will be looking more at specific examples. And we will really dive into things like, how do you determine treatment? You know, how do you identify what something is based upon the record? So we'll look at a lot more records, and we will actually be digging into some of those specific situations you may be encountering. So on that note, if you'll just tell me a little tiny bit about yourself, maybe where you work or your position, any specifics or questions you would like me to address. And in terms of me, I have been doing training for a while and cataloging for a while, but I will fess up right now and say I did not start out my library career as a cataloger. In fact, I started out in public services, and I worked in a large academic library, and I worked in the access services or circulation department, and I always said I worked in Complaint Central because I was the place that people came to when they lost a book or they got flagged or banned from the library or something like that. So they didn't return books and they had to pay fines. If the fines got so high they couldn't register, or they couldn't check out more books, or they couldn't graduate. So they were not happy people when they got to me. But along the way, I was working with the collection development department. So when a patron lost a book, we would try to replace it and things like that. So I started searching in books and print, and started searching to find replacement copies for things that got lost. When you work in a large academic library, things get lost. We had a couple of buildings that either got flooded, in one case flooded, another one got had a fire. So, as those books were lost or books got damaged just in the course of use, I was the one who would try to find the replacement copies for them. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed searching. I enjoyed looking at the information, and I really enjoyed that kind of process. So when there was a position that came open in the cataloging department, I thought, wow, this sounds kind of interesting. I don't really know what these words mean, but I know what some of it means, and it sounds really interesting. So I applied, and they hired me. And once I got to cataloging, I realized that was kind of, as some people say these days, that was my jam. I really enjoyed working with the records. I had a lot to learn, obviously, so I understand what it means to look at a MARC record and have no idea what it means, because that's exactly where I started. So what is cataloging? Like, what are we trying to do? And so one of the things catalogers have been doing, say in the last 10 years, is we took a step back and we started thinking and looking at what we actually do and what the purpose of the work we do is. And so we're attempting to organize the materials and information in a logical and consistent way so that people can find it. So, that's why we put things on the shelves in certain orders. We group things by subjects in a certain order. All of that is so that the materials are organized and our patrons can find things. I mean, that is really the goal of what we're working on. And sometimes you don't hear this term too much anymore, but I think it's a good term, so I've still been using it. Cataloging is sometimes referred to aboutness. Like what is an item about? What is that resource about? And we're going to explore that as we go along. And then sort of on a more practical note, maybe what you've sort of seen already or have experienced, cataloging is metadata, and we're going to talk more about what that means in a minute too. And, at a really basic level, things like alphabetizing your address book or your contact list, if you're putting people together alphabetically, or maybe you group them by family and work relationships or something like that, that organization process that you're doing right there is a form of cataloging. If you color code anything, that is a form of cataloging. If you, I've been working on my planner and putting all the months in and, organizing it all, that is a form of cataloging. It's a very simple form of cataloging, and it's not exactly the same as what we do in libraries, but that act of organizing and arranging something in a particular group by our own definition, of course, when we're doing our address book, but that is a form of cataloging, a type of cataloging. So cataloging involves analyzing and describing a resource. And so as you are thinking about the work you do, when you sit down to get that first thing that you may get to catalog, in the back of your mind, just kind of keep this in sort of right back there in the back of your mind, like the process that you're going to do. And so if you're a person, at one point I, was a solo librarian, did everything. I know some of you are probably that too. And, finding the time to sit down and catalog or do this kind of work was really, really hard. And, sometimes I would try to do it when I was out on the reference desk and whatever. And I would say, especially if you're trying to learn, maybe try to find a way to carve out just a little tiny bit of time, because it needs a thought process. Once you get more experienced in cataloging and you have a little bit more expertise and you know what you're looking for and you don't have to look up as much, although catalogers look up stuff their entire careers, but maybe you don't have to look up quite as much stuff as you do initially, then you might be able to do that during a time. But my experience from having tried to do this work while I'm sitting at a reference desk where someone could come up and interrupt me at any minute and drag me off, and I'm working on other things, and then I come back 2 hours later and where was I and what was I doing? It's a really challenging thing to try to do while you're doing other tasks. So if you're just getting started, or even if you've already been doing this and you're sort of struggling with, like, how do I do this work, and maybe I'm getting behind, or it seems like it's just always sort of building up around me, see if you can somehow carve out just a little tiny bit of time, even if it's just an hour or two every week, where that's all you do. So I know for the solo librarians of you and those of you who have multiple duties, that carving out an hour or two of work to devote to nothing but cataloging is a huge thing to ask. But if you can do that, you will find that not only will your expertise grow, your confidence will grow, but you will have that dedicated time to focus on doing this work so that you can analyze the resource that you have in front of you. And then after you have that analysis process, then the describing part of it to me is the easier part. The analyzing, like, what do I have? How do I catalog this? What fields do I use? That's the more tricky part of it. Once you get to actually describing it, what is the title? I already know, I've already found the title. How do I record it? That part gets a lot easier. So that's my soapbox. So we're going to look at what is it? What do you have to catalog? And this could be a digital object. For those of you who are digitizing and scanning local histories or photographs, or maybe you're collecting oral archives, this could be some other format. It could be digital, it could be a tape, it could be something else. And then one of the things that we look at when we're cataloging is what information is, what information is provided about the work. So what information do you have available? And, for a book, this is usually pretty easy to figure out. Now, if you're dealing with independently published materials, artist books, really old material, some of these things I'll tell you about where to look for information is going to go right out the window, because there was no sort of publishing standards or even any consistency in publishing. So, we're looking, but generally when we think about a book, just think about any book you might get off your shelf. You're going to see things like a title page that has the title on it and the author and things like that. Book covers or book jackets, if you are a library that, especially that collects a lot of sort of a contemporary fiction or popular fiction, almost all of them will have some kind of fancy book jacket on them. If you're doing a DVD or movie, you're going to have those title screens, credits, you're going to have the container, all that kind of stuff. So the sources of information, and we're going to talk more about the choices for that source of information. But really, when you're cataloging, you look at all the information that's available to you. And you sort of start with a prioritized list, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then what subjects is the work about? Is it about just one subject or multiple subjects? And we'll talk more about that too as we go forward, especially in part 2. And then how can we best describe and organize the work so our patrons can find it? Do we have a special collection of local history? Is that how we're going to organize the stuff? If we're doing web content, are we going to create a little website or a software to put all these digital materials in so we can kind of highlight or feature them? Do we have a reference collection for those materials and resources that our patrons are going to go to just to ask a quick question? How do we organize things so that our patrons can find it best? What's going to work for them? And this is really different from library to library. There are some consistencies. I mean, a lot of libraries do have a reference collection. This may be a digital reference collection, or it may be a physical collection that has dictionaries and encyclopedias and things like that. A lot of libraries collect contemporary or popular fiction. It may be that it's just shelved on the shelf in its call number order, or you may actually have a collection someplace that you organize those materials so that patrons can just come in and quickly see, like the New York Times bestsellers. So we have different ways of organizing things. But our goal is to help our users find what they want and need using our data. So that's what catalogers, our piece in this. So, when people talk about cataloging, a lot of times they think cataloging is just like we're working behind the scenes. There's no customer service in cataloging, and that's the exact opposite of the truth. In fact, I will go as far as to say it is a falsehood that has been perpetuated by our community, because catalogers are very much a part of this. If our data is junky or our data is not good, then our patrons can't find it. If we organize things in a way and arrange them on the shelf in a way that our patrons can't find them, we are doing a big disservice to our community, right? So, can our users find what they're looking for? Can they identify it? Can they actually look at that record, look at our data that we've created, and can they first, using the search engines, using our ILS, can they search and find what they're looking for? So can they identify from that list of resources that that's what they want? And then can they select it? Can they choose it? And this may be, if you have digital files you're working with, it may be, can they from that list choose an appropriate resource that they want or need? And then can they obtain it? Can they access it? So in the case of digital files, can they open it on their phone or their computer? Can they download it? Do they understand that process from the information we're providing them? And then finally, this is a new one for us in the cataloging world. Can they explore? And this is this idea of serendipity or browsability or discoverability. Can they discover other things that are related to that particular resource? So as a cataloger, does the data that we create allow this process to happen? Do we facilitate this process of our users being able to find and actually be able to get those items that they want and need? Do we, with our data, facilitate this exploration and being able to browse and find other related things? We haven't done the last one too well yet, but we are looking at ways to do that. We'll talk a little bit about that more in part 2. The other thing I would say about this is that um, we are limited somewhat in terms of the software we work in, right? So even though we can do things with our data, we can add information, we can do things in terms of how we describe our resources to help facilitate this process. We are limited by our software. We are also limited by what? By that MARC formatting. And we're going to talk about that a lot in a minute because this is a huge barrier in terms of what we as catalogers can do with our data. So, as a new cataloger or someone who wears multiple hats in catalogs, especially if you work a lot with the public, you are in a really unique position to be able to help the patrons understand why they can't find what they're looking for if you know that you have it. Because you will understand the challenges that our data faces in between what we have to do, the structure we have to use, the coding we have to use, and then what our patron is expecting from this Amazon, Google, kind of world where they can do all of this stuff. So, we are limited as catalogers by our systems and by our formatting and by the encoding we use. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. But like I said, as a person who is working with all the different people in your community, and if you are a cataloger and you are more behind the scenes as a person, just know that, we are looking at how we can catalog for the future. And we'll be talking more about that over these next two sessions in terms of sort of future proofing, as they would say. So getting our data ready, not really cataloging to our limitations of our current system. So we'll talk more about that. But as a person who is cataloging, regardless what role you may play in the library, you have a very unique insight into the challenges that we all face as people who do this work in terms of facilitating this process. So in 2000, in 2000, let's see, we're at 10 years now, so it'd be 2008-ish, there was a group that got together at this national level in the cataloging community, and they were looking at our cataloging rules, and we're going to talk more about this in just a second, but they were looking at our cataloging rules. One of the things they actually did was, well, we need to think about what we actually do in terms of cataloging, what we're hoping to achieve, what our goals are. And so one of the goals they came up with was this list, actually, of user expectations, our user task. And we're going to talk more just a tiny bit about what FERBER means in just a second, but this is the FERBER user task. Can our users find, identify, select, obtain, and explore? So when you go out in the world and you start reading more about user task, or you start reading more about FERBER, this is the user task. This is what our data should achieve. This is what catalogers should be facilitating with the data they create. This is what you should be facilitating as the data you create or edit or maintain. So getting back to the practical a little bit before we get into more of that alphabet soup, what does a cataloger look for when describing an item? In the practical, what are we looking at? What are we actually looking at when we're going to describe a resource? Well, we're going to look at the title, and we're going to actually look at the MARC fields for these. We're just going to look at the top level right now. We're going to look at the title. What is the title of that item? And this comes from the item itself, and it's transcribed by the cataloger. And transcribed means recorded exactly from that resource. And we're going to talk, like I said, more about the MARC part of it in just a minute, but we're just kind of go through the basics right now. So first, we're going to look at the title. That's probably the easiest thing to look at on most things. If you are cataloging, let's say you're cataloging a chair, or maybe you're cataloging another piece of furniture that's coming from a collection. You're cataloging a photograph. Those items, by the nature of what they are not going to have a title. So those items you would construct a title, and we'll talk a little bit more about constructing titles over the next two sessions. So if you have a title that is on the item, books are pretty easy most of the time, right? The title's on the book someplace. you're going to use what is there and record it as it appears on your resource. If it's not there, and it is an item that would not have a title associated with it, like a photograph or a piece of furniture, a piece of artwork, any of that kind of stuff, then you're going to create those. And we'll talk a little bit more about those coming up. Titles can also be harvested from OCR, and that's that optical character recognition where you scan something and it generates some text. You know, it tries to read the scan and actually turn it into text. So titles can be generated in that way. And that may come from the title page itself, which is usually the first page in a book that serves as the official record of it. And we're actually going to look at this and talk about this more in a second. So from a book, it's usually that first page in a book that serves as the official record of that book. Or for movies, this appears on the title screen. And so we'll talk more about the challenges of movies in a minute. But so that's not the container. For a movie, the title, according to our guidelines for how we catalog these things, comes from the title screen. So we'll talk more about this as we go along, and I'll give you some choices to help make it easier. So we look at titles first, recorded as it appears on the item, on your resource, or if you need to construct a title for photographs and things like that, we'll talk more about how to actually do that. You would construct a title. Then we are going to record who created it, if we know that information based upon the information presented to us in the resource. So this could be the author, it could be the editor, it could be an illustrator, and then any people who participated in the creation of the work. And so this is something we are actually doing more of with cataloging than we've done, say, 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, back in the olden, it doesn't seem like it should be that olden, back in the olden days of cataloging, we would have recorded the author and then maybe the illustrator, maybe. Especially for children's books, we would have recorded the illustrator. We would not have recorded a gazillion other people associated with a particular resource. Now, under our new cataloging rules, which are RDA, and we're going to talk the alphabet soup part of it in just a minute, but that's our rules or guidelines we're using now. We do record any people that participate in it who have a important or relevant role. My opinion is anyone that's listed on the title page, anybody that's listed, you know, on the book jacket or the cover that is participating, the illustrator, the editor, other authors, all of those people should be listed. For movies or DVDs, that would be everybody listed in the credits. Now, are you going to go all the way down to the key grip? You could. But you may just want to hit, you know, the majors, producer, director, all the actors, maybe screenwriter. Certainly if you have music by John Williams or someone who's famous, then you probably want to include that too. So, you know, you're going to kind of have to think a little bit more about how far you go. Because in theory, under our new rules, new as of 2008-ish, 2010, under those new rules, we could record every single person that's listed in the credits of a movie, as well as on the title screens. And then for books, we could do the same. We could record kind of everything. And we'll talk more about sort of how do you record and choose people and things like that. But basically, we record the title from the resource itself as it appears on the resource. So transcribed, we actually just key it as we see it. And then we're going to record our creators, so who the author is. And then we're also going to have another place, another MARC field, where we'll put all the other people who participated in it. So if we have multiple authors, the first author is the first author listed on the title page is the primary author. And we'll talk more about what that means because it actually has a big role. And we'll talk more about that in this session and then more in part 2. Creators, and by creators I mean any of these people who participated in any way in the creation of this work, we actually link them to an authorized, and what an authorized form means, it means the official form of their name. And we're going to look at some examples and we'll talk more about what that means. Then we're going to describe the resource. We're just kind of going through our basic checklist of what we're looking at when we're looking at cataloging a resource. So first we're going to do the title. We're going to transcribe it as it appears on the piece, appears on the item, except for things that do not have a title associated with them by the nature of what they are. And we've already given some examples for that. Then we're going to look at who created it. And we might just start with a scratch piece of paper. I mean, I have literally started with a Post-it note to catalog. So not a little tiny one, but a nice 3.5 by 5. Because, before you get started, you're going to want to make some notes. And especially if you're going to record your information about your movie from the title screen, you're really going to need to make some notes because you're going to need to view it, or in some cases, as I've worked with, some libraries, they have a student worker or volunteer who actually sits down and just writes information down on a notepad, and then the cataloger uses that. So there's ways to help doing this, but taking notes as you go through this process is very useful. And you'll still, of course, have your resource available to you when you actually are creating the data in the record. But before you can create the record in the data, you have to know what you're going to put in that record, right? So we'll start with the title. So we got that transcribed from the piece or the resource. Creators, we're going to look at all of our list of participants. We get that. And then we're going to describe, we're actually going to look at the format and the extent. So how big it is, how long it is, what size it is, all of that stuff. So this could be what the file format is. So, if it's a text PDF, we need to know that. Is it an image in a JPEG format? We'd need to know that. Is it a book that's a volume? And if so, how big is it? We'd need to know that too. So if you're original cataloging, so this is what we're talking about right now. If you're starting to create a record from scratch because there was no record there, this would be the kind of information that you would be looking for. As a copy cataloger who's looking for information, this is also the kind of information you're reviewing. So you're looking at the title in that record. Does that title match what's on my item? Because the ISBN is not just the checkpoint. You've got to look at other things. So, is my title a match? Are the creators listed? Do they appear on my piece? Are they there? Does the description of that resource match my resource? Does it have 55 pages? Now, I'm going to say, having done this kind of work a lot and done a lot of copy cataloging, I have always kept a ruler at my desk in centimeters. I do. However, as a copy cataloger, you get pretty good. You can go, yeah, that's about 24 centimeters. So you'll know. If you have something that says it's 248 centimeters and your book can fit on your desk and you have an average size desk, that is probably not 248 centimeters. So, you can get a good idea of ballparking your sizes without getting out your ruler, but it is always useful to have a ruler. Measurements are generally rounded up. So if they're a 1/2 centimeter or more, they're generally rounded up. However, there are some catalogers out there who will round down. So, if you're off a little bit, if you actually get out and start measuring, books and looking at the records, you may be off a centimeter or two. So don't stress about that if you're just off a centimeter or two, unless information elsewhere differs. So if the paging's different, the title's different, anything's different, at that point you have a different edition. And we'll talk about those in part 2, but that's just sort of a checkpoint. So, then we're looking at the description, about the format and the extent. So that's, what we're going to look at, whether it has illustrations or not, that kind of thing. And then what type of an item is it? Is it a movie, a book, a magazine or journal, database, photograph? There's so many more things besides that. That's just a few I've listed. But, we can, for the most part, I think we can determine if we have a movie. We can determine usually if we have a database or photograph. I mean, those are pretty easy to determine, right? The ones that get tricky sometimes can be, is it a serial? Is it a magazine? What is it? Book? those things can get tricky, and so we are definitely going to look at those in part 2, and I'll give you some guidelines today just to kind of um, find those. And then finally, we kind of look at what the work is about. If multiple items are represented in one work in one resource, then the metadata may include a table of contents or a list of the parts. And sometimes catalogers put in notes about the item itself. So there may be some additional information that we need to provide. I once cataloged a multi-volume set. So it was a set that had started in the late 1800s, and volume 1 through like 10 had already been published, and volume 11 came out in 2012. So the university had decided to start publishing this again. The editor had died, and they decided they were going to start publishing it again. And so there was about a 100-year gap between volume 10 and volume 11. That is very unusual, and of course a lot of things had changed from volume 11 to volume 10, including the size, things like that. So the cataloger who cataloged volume 11 thankfully had put in copious notes to explain this volume 11 really was part of this work that started in the late 1800s, and really explained the whole process. And so it made it very easy when I got volume 11 to say, yes, it just fits on this record, and I just create a label and boom, boom, move on, and I'm done. It was very easy to deal with that. So sometimes catalogers, and I would encourage you as catalogers, that if you have some information that you're privy to, the publisher has told you something, there's some information on the book jacket, and you're going to take that book jacket off, as many libraries do, make sure to note that information for the person who comes along after you. And that may be in your own library. You may inventory at some point, and you're looking at records and you think, well, this book is attached to this record. Why is there a difference? There needs to be some explanation in that record. So we'll talk more about that, but those notes to each other can be so very, very valuable. They can also be useful to our patrons, right? If you are looking for that volume 11 and it was published in 2002 or whatever it was, and you see a record that says 1897 in the date, you would think this can't be what I'm looking for. So to have that explanation that volume 11 is a continuation and there was almost 100-year publishing gap because of that is useful for our patrons as well. Subjects, and these are not just keywords, and we're going to talk more about what these mean in a minute. And then of course, for subjects, we are selecting these. So they come off of what's called a controlled vocabulary. A controlled vocabulary is a list that we're choosing off of. So although Library of Congress subject headings are a huge multi-level list, they're a gigantic list, in fact, multiple lists combined together. When they first started out, it was literally a book of subject headings, a book of topics. Same thing with Dewey. They're multiple levels now, but they didn't used to be multiple levels. They were very, very simple when they started. And we're going to talk more about controlled vocabularies a little bit later, but just know that it is a list that we have to choose off of. So if we are cataloging and we say, I'm going to use Library of Congress subject headings, you can't just make up something and put it into that field. It has to be off that list. Same thing with Dewey. If you're going to use Dewey or you're going to use Sears, the subject headings for children's works, if you say you're using that and you code that field to be a Sears subject heading, you should be picking off that Sears list. And if you're not, if you're just making it up or winging it, then you're creating a potential error. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later as we go along, and I'll try to give you some hints about things you can do to make that easier too. We also, as catalogers, create specific coding to assist library catalogs and systems in finding our materials. And this is really to facilitate our users finding what they need. And that is just part of the process of what we do. So Cataloging really involves 3 different pieces of this, and this is why I say that if you can just carve out just a little bit, and maybe if you need to make a case to your director or your administration, like, I need just 2 hours a week, or I need an hour, whatever time you can, an hour a day, whatever time you may need to carve out. One, to do some training and to be able, I mean, you're doing training now and you've carved out time for this, but also then to do some applied training. So take what you learned today, sit down and be able to work through some of the examples I've given you. Or maybe sit down with what you've learned today and then kind of look at some of the resources that you have to work on. So, being able to carve out a little bit of time. And I know asking librarians to carve out time is a huge ask. I do. That's why I said even if it's just an hour or two. Maybe it could be an hour a day. Maybe if your mornings aren't very busy, maybe the mornings when you're going to do your cataloging. Maybe you'll actually put a sign up that you're cataloging. You know, only disturb me in emergencies. Or, if cataloging doesn't sound like a thing that's going to pass, then maybe it's time dedicated to training, or time dedicated, maybe you can call it whatever would work for you in terms of carving out that time. Because cataloging is a very it's both an intellectual activity and a mechanical activity. So the intellectual activity, to me, is the piece of it that takes the most time. When you actually sit down to write or input what goes into a record, at that point you've already done all of this decision work. So we describe the resource, and this is what's called description. So when you hear catalogers sometimes or trainers talk about description, that's just describing the resource. And it's not only describing the resource, but it's also meant to create an accurate record of what a library holds. And by holds, that means owns. Now, by ownership, it can mean we bought it. It can mean we've been gifted it. It could mean somebody left it on our doorstep. Owning something means a lot of different things in libraries. It could also mean something that's freely available, such as some OER content, some open educational resources content, maybe something your faculty have donated. So owning it doesn't necessarily mean purchase. It can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So we're describing, this description, the resource to create an accurate record of what a library holds or owns. And this is often called a holding. So when you look in OCLC, if you use OCLC, you'll see how many holdings, that's how many libraries owns that. And if you own it, it should say held by your institution there. Then we do the subject analysis. Now, if you're copy cataloging, and you're looking for that record that matches, the librarian who came before you has hopefully already done this part of it. Sometimes when you have records that are created by digitizing process, they're not going to have the subject headings. Or maybe you find a record out there, you've got something that's kind of unique and you find the only record out there, one library, someplace across the world has a copy and they've created a record, but maybe the subject headings are all in French or some other language. There will be times as a copy cataloger that you may need to do some subject analysis, and I'll try to give you some hints for doing that. But subject analysis is analyzing the content of the resource to determine its subject or its aboutness. And this is where catalogers provide contextual information to our resource. Because out of the box, when the publisher, sends the resource to a library, whoever that library may be that gets it first, until that cataloger looks at it and makes some decisions, there's no record at that point of actually what the subjects are. Sometimes a publisher will give you keywords and some ideas and things like that, but they're not always accurate in terms of what they think the subject should be. And of course, they don't always know the ins and outs of Library of Congress subject headings or Dewey or Sears or whatever you may use. And then finally, there's classification. And this is where I get to my little cartoon here. It is our act of putting things in their place. And so this is where we determine how we're going to organize and what we call arrange. So how we're going to organize and arrange that resource. how to classify it in a collection. This is where it will shelve if it's a physical or print resource. And it could be the call number. So maybe you shelve just by call number. Maybe you create a collection for things. And then it could also be the location where it resides. If you're in a system and you have multiple libraries and books are purchased at one library and you share a database and you have locations, each library has its own location, then maybe the location would be part of your information that would be part of that classification. So, cataloging used to look like this. And I think in some ways we're all still fond for the card catalog days, and they're really cool piece of furniture if you find them. But we are really looking at moving much further away from this. Our records, so we create records, and at one point our record, so really our documentation of that resource that we own, lived in the card catalog. That was a record. Now, it was not an electronic record, it was a print record, right? But it was still a record of what we held or what we owned as libraries. So that's what the card catalog was used for in terms of inventory purposes. Of course, for our students and our patrons and our community members, they use the card catalog to find things. So we had sort of multiple kinds of, some libraries had multiple kinds of card catalogs. You might have one by title, and then you might have had one by call number or one by author. So some libraries had multiple card catalogs to help patrons to be able to find things, because we did not have computers, we did not have the electronic age to be able to deal with this. Of course, we moved along, and first kind of thing was we had to get our records out of a print format. And that's really where MARC came into it. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. But our records are used by search engines. And this is such as our own ILS, our integrated library system, right? So that software that you have on your website that searches all your resources, that is a search engine of sorts. And it's really built to search and retrieve what we own, right? So our patrons can find what we have in the building or that we buy, maybe electronically. And then of course we also use the record. So the record that we create, and this is part of that user experience, right? So the record that we create is used by the search engines that is in our website, that ILS. And of course, that's what our students are searching, right? Or maybe they're searching Google, but Google Scholar could be that too. Hopefully, eventually, they will get to our record though. So our record's used by these search engines out there. And then of course, we also use a record for inventory, our own very own inventory purposes. What do we have? How many volumes do we have? What's checked out? All of that kind of stuff. Circulation, accounting purposes. How much is our collection worth? So we use records. We use our record that we create. There's a lot of stuff gets attached around it. And this could be like an order record. It could be a donor record, a gift record. How do we get this item? How much is it worth? Where did it come from? If it's a subscription, the subscription could even be attached to our record. So there's a lot more that kind of gets attached to a record that we may work on. So our record is often either the start of it or the center of it. So sometimes our record is the first record that gets put in, and then the book gets ordered against, the item gets ordered against, and then the cataloger, whoever it may be, the thing comes in, you take a look at the record, or maybe if it comes from a vendor, you just accept it as it is and don't bother reviewing it. Either way, that record is sort of the center of that universe in terms of the records in our catalog. So remember, I mentioned FRBR just briefly. FRBR stands for Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time in the alphabet soup of this stuff, but I wanted you to be aware of some of the terminology, because you're going to hear and see some of this when you start looking at cataloging stuff. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but just think about what functional means. Okay, functional. That means having a purpose. It means it works, right? Something functions. It does what it's supposed to do. Requirements. I think we all know what requirements mean, right? Things that are required. So if you look at the language, functional requirements for bibliographic records, it actually means exactly what it says. What do we require of our catalog records? What do we require that our catalog records be able to do? Now, remember, I mentioned the user tasks that we've looked at. So one of the things that we require as a community is that our records help achieve or facilitate the users being able to find things, those user tasks. So that's one thing that's in there. And really, the big part of this in terms of where we're going today is that really what you need to know is that it was really one of 3 conceptual models. So we were looking at we're starting to look at how we actually modeled our data and what we want our data to achieve. So this all started before we looked at revising our cataloging rules. So before we could actually revise our rules, I mean, we knew they needed to be revised. They had been around since, I think the last revision was like the late 1990s, mid 1990s. And, you know, digital world, social media, mobile, I mean, there's a lot that happened in the late 90s and mid 2000s, right? I mean, the whole world has changed in terms of technology. So we knew we needed to take our older rules that had really been really really had been sort of just we were looking at how we could take a card catalog, a print card catalog, and turn it into a record. So back in these days, and this had sort of been kicking around in our rules had been sort of the same format really up until the mid 1990s. Now, there were libraries that still created cards. There were still cards being printed up until 1996. So there were still some cards kicking around out there. But most libraries had some kind of electronic database at that point that they were creating records in. So, you know, libraries had sort of moved to having, I mean, you know, we talk about ILSs today, we talk about our search, we talk about our websites. Think about where things were, if you can remember the olden days, or if you were not around in the olden days, then go look at the Internet Archive, go look at the Wayback Machine, and go pick some library's website and see how far back it goes. Because it probably doesn't go back much further than like the late 1990s. So, you know, we'd been kicking around with sort of the card catalog for a while, and that had been very consistent because, of course, there was no databases, there was no web. Oops. And we had been kind of kicking around with that for a while, you know, how we were going to move forward and how we were going to really get out of this and really start moving to, well, where we are here. You know, where we are in terms of the interconnected, everything's connected environment. So we started out with Ferber. So we started out looking at what information that catalogers create and what information, you know, how that information should be used. And we started looking at, you know, really looking at where we were in the digital landscape. Now, one thing we didn't really do was we didn't do a good job of foreseeing how interconnected we were actually going to be. Along the way, we actually created 2 more models, and we're not going to talk about the models too much today. That's really all we're going to talk about them. But we created 2 more models, and these were created by different committees and different groups at the national level. They were meant to all fit together to make sure that all the data that catalogers create really can be used in this larger web world, and to help drive our library catalog development, help drive that ILS development, to give the ILS programmers, you know, the people who write our code, to give them a framework to look at, and to help us get to this interconnected, everything fits together. We didn't quite foresee like exactly how user-centered it was going to be and how everything will work together. we just kind of missed that part of it a little bit. So one of the things that kind of came out of all this discussions is that we could actually create records in a different way. So rather than creating one record in terms of describing our resource. Now, in your catalog, you may have a barcode record, you may have a holding record that has a call number in it, you may have an order record, you may have a lot of records associated with your resource. But just looking at the resource description, what we call the bibliographic record, or you might call it the MARC record, just looking at that record itself, it's just one record in our systems. Now, in the process of kind of doing this abstract, and we really got into the philosophy of cataloging. We talked about how our users use data, how could we do different things. We started looking at how we could share data between records better. And so one of the ideas that has come out is that we could share records. So we could create this sort of master record where all the different printings and versions could share information. So for example, if you have Dracula, there's like a gazillion movies that are Dracula, right? And there's a lot of different printings of Dracula, different language, different editions of Dracula, illustrations, graphic novels, all kinds of things of Dracula. So we could have this one record at the top for Dracula, and it would do things like it might include the same author for all the things that are actually a Bram Stoker version. It would include the same subjects because, of course, the story of Dracula stays the same across all of those. And those could all be shared with a master record of sorts. For copy catalogers, this would be a big win because we would know that some of the information in our record was inherited from that master record. And so we would know that it's really been checked. It's one record kind of sharing all of that information, so we wouldn't need to worry about checking things so much. From a original cataloging standpoint, it would mean that you could use information from that master record in your record, and you wouldn't have to check things as much either. But we don't really have systems that could do this. So this is one of these things in cataloging when we were looking at how we could do cataloging different. That is a great idea that has never really been realized. There's a lot of projects out there to try to make this happen. There is no actual process out there in terms of making ILSs happen. Now, in the future, as we continue down this road of becoming more interconnected and moving ourselves forward into being a part of this larger web community instead of the card catalog, we may see something like this. So if you're out in the landscape or you're out in the readings and you read or you hear WIMI, that is Work Expression Manifestation Item. And really it's this idea of a large master record where we can share things that are common across all versions and editions of a particular work. And that would be things like Bram Stoker for all of Bram Stoker stuff, and it would also be subjects for all the subject things. In theory, this would save us time in cataloging. We wouldn't have to check things. If you're original cataloging, you wouldn't have to type things in. Sorry to say, who knows if we'll ever get to there. So for most of us, although we've come up with this potential way of breaking our data up, we are just cataloging at what's considered the manifestation level. This is the item that comes across our desk, or the copy that comes across our desk, the volume that comes across our desk. And so everything we put into a record, because we don't have a way to do this, we just put everything into that one record, right? So you put the subject headings into that one record, you put everything into that one record. So, we put everything into that one record. Of course, the item, that's where we barcode things. So if you hear WIMI or you see this, just know that it's a great idea, and we'll talk a little bit about it in part 2, because there are a couple of places where we can sort of do some of this work, but not really. But we'll talk a little bit about why we do it and how we do it in part 2. But just know, if you see WIMI or you hear people talking about work expression manifestation item, that's what WMI is, then you're just cataloging at the manifestation level. If you really want to know that, that's where you are, but you're just going to follow cataloging rules, and really that's all there is to know about that. Like I said, we don't have the ability to do this kind of record in most of our systems. We can't do the work and expression part of it. So because of that, we just kind of put everything into that bibliographic record. Now, if you have a item record or a barcode record, you have this level underneath. So we catalog at this manifestation level, which is the tangible thing. This is the thing that comes across your desk, and we do barcode it. So that piece of it we have in most of our catalogs. And actually, if you have holding records, they would go in there. So essentially the manifestation level record is what we'd call the bibliographic record. You might call it the MARC record in your catalog. There might be a holding record in between there, but holding records are not consistent across all library cataloging environments, so they're not included in this model because they're not the same. So some libraries have them, some libraries don't. If you have a holding record, it would go between the manifestation and the item or barcode record. So this is a good idea should we ever get to this, and you don't, in my opinion, really need to worry about this, but you will see some of this terminology when you're out there looking at cataloging stuff. So that's really all we're going to talk about in terms of that, because we're going to be all at the manifestation level. So I've already been alphabet souping you a little bit, but new models lead to new rules. So, you know, we looked at what we were doing. We sort of looked at the kind of material we're cataloging, all this digital stuff. We've got new rules now. And the new rules, or as they want to be known as, guidelines. Do not say rules anymore, although I do all the time, but they want to be known as guidelines. This is RDA, or Resource Description Access. This is a revision of the cataloging rules, and they were called rules back then. And the cataloging rules were AACR2, which is Anglo-American Cataloging Rules 2nd edition. So that's what it means. These RDA was published in 2000. That was the first publication date of these new guidelines or rules, and implementation date is considered 2013. Now, if you have not implemented, then don't fret too much. You're not the only library that has not implemented. In fact, I talked to lots of libraries who are not implementing. Implementation just means, have you made a decision about what you're doing? That's really all implementation means. If you get records from vendors, have you told your vendor, I only want an RDA level record. I only want an RDA record. Do not send me any records in under any other guidelines. I just want an RDA quality record. Have you told them that? If you have, then you've implemented RDA. When you do original cataloging, if you create an original record, a record that's not already in OCLC, or not already in your system, are you following RDA? If you are, you have implemented RDA. Do you just take whatever record you find in OCLC, and if it matches, you import your record and you don't worry about anything else about it? If you do that, then you haven't truly implemented RDA because you haven't made that decision, but it's okay to do that. It may be that you've implemented RDA, and the fact that you are learning about RDA and you've become familiar with it, and you still, when you go to OCLC, if you find a record and it's an older record, you just use it, and that's fine. And that's all fine. RDA implementation just means you've made some kind of decision about what you're going to do in terms of this new guideline. That's really all it means. So one of the things that RDA did, well, there's a few things that RDA did, but we'll just hit the high points. It is releasing us from being so MARC-centric. And as we look at MARC coding in this next little bit, you'll see like how structured it is and how challenging it can be to work with. So it's providing us a way forward to a new data structure. Our older cataloging rules were tied very much to MARC. So there was no MARC, there was no AACR2 without MARC. So those two things were just tied together. You know, there's just no other way to do it. So one of the things it did was it separated us, the content of the record, from how the data can be created. So RDA can be expressed or created in a lot of different formats. It can be in a MARC record, which most of us have seen at this point. It could be in something like XML and BibFrame. We're not going to really talk about those, but those are kind of other things that it can be created into by our communities. There's a lot of semantic web languages out there, so languages out on the general web for doing metadata kind of work, and we could use our guidelines for content description, which are RDA. We could use those in that way. It also reached out to peer communities like archives and museums to see if we could partner up a little better, developed with e-resources in mind. So we're going to talk more about that, what that means in just a second, and it's meant to be international. So we got rid of that Anglo-American aspect because AACR2 had been translated into numerous languages, and it really was not fair that we sort of, kind of claimed it as being Anglo-American when yet this international community was using it. So currently RDA is being translated into, they've already done some translations, but they're increasing what they translate it to. We're going to talk more about MARC and RDA, the connection between those, as we dive into the cataloging part of it, but I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of like where we're going. So one more thing has happened in terms of all of this foundation or framework for how we do cataloging. We had those three models that fit together or were meant to fit together, Ferber being one of them, and then there's two other models. There's functional requirements for authority data, functional requirements for subject authority data. One of the models, the functional requirements for subject authority data, was never completed, so it was never finished. And these models didn't really work together anyway. So really the only thing you need to know about the models is if you just understand what Ferber is, what we've talked about here, that functional requirements for bibliographic records, and then those user tasks, because the user tasks are really one of the big pieces that came out of that. And so we had these three models that work together, and then the latest development, just as of 2017, is to collapse these three models into one. And this is called the Library Reference Model, or the LRM. And if you look in the RDA toolkit, which is the place where the guidelines and rules for RDA live, you will start seeing the new language in that. So it updated some language, and it sort of combined these three models together. It also updated our models for more modern data practices, so that was a good thing. And it's kind of moving us down the road a little bit. So really all I want you to take away from that is that 2017, we collapsed these three models that had been in place before. So these were what the RDA guidelines were built on in terms of how we describe our content. How do we describe a resource? So what does that mean really? Well, what that means is 2017, we collapsed the models. 2018, we began to look at how this was going to impact our guidelines, the RDA, and going forward, we're going to continue that conversation. So in practicality, what this means is we are going to see some changes in the next few years in terms of how we catalog things. And I suspect, having studied the LRM and teaching on the LRM, what I find to be the potential change is really going to be on serials and things that are issued, anything that is issued over multiple dates. So if you have a collection of books and volume 1 comes out or volume 10 comes out in the late 1800s, volume 11 doesn't come out to the 2000s, some of the ideas and thoughts within the LRM in terms of those kinds of situations are going to change. I don't have my crystal ball to know exactly what that's going to mean right now, and there are these national communities that are starting to look at things that have multiple dates. For now, in terms of cataloging, I would say stay the course And, as you become more involved in the cataloging community, or you join listservs, or you hear things from your system or your consortia, you will hear more information as decisions are determined. But it's going to take a little while for this to happen, but just know that we have some decisions to come, decisions to kind of think about. This is one of the decisions is not only about multi-date, things issued on multi-date, but things that are multiple parts. So let's say you want to catalog one MP3 of a song, or you want to catalog one journal article in a journal. We haven't had a really good way of doing that. So that's the other thing they're kind of looking at is, our content is fragmenting on the web. We less and less go buy a whole album. We just buy one song, or we may even just buy one journal article. So we're studying for something, or we want to read something, we just read one blog post, one newspaper article, one journal article. So how we use resources on the web is quickly changing to not only something very individual and customized, but we're choosing to just read part of something. Now there's some, there's all kinds of discussion about whether or not that's a good thing, but that's where we're going right now. So how do we as catalogers, how can we be able to facilitate that process? Facilitate what our users are doing and what they want to do. So we've got lots more to think about as we think about how people are using those kind of resources. Things that are issued over dates, things that are multiple parts of something else. How do we deal with those? And some of you may already be dealing with those things because they are things that we're already starting to see. So we describe the resources that we collect, and this is the same process as what museum and archival people do. They have different guidelines. They may call it something different. They may call it metadata versus cataloging. They're still doing the same thing. So metadata is just data about data. And from a cataloging sense, that is creating data about a resource. So that's what we're doing. We call our data bibliographic data, which is data about bibliographies or a list of books. So just if you ever wondered where that came from. Metadata includes different types of data which serve different purposes. What we create is called descriptive. So you remember we were talking about description earlier, descriptive metadata. And then there are other people out there who may be working with like rights management, and that'd be like copyright, or structural metadata. And things like structural metadata are things like file names, file sizes, things like that. And I just want to give you an example because we all probably have seen structural metadata and not really thought about it. So, if you look at Microsoft Office, when you go to save something, you'll have a place where you can put a file name in. There's some structural metadata. There's the file type. There's some information that's structural metadata. Now we would, if we were cataloging this, we would also describe that, right? We'd say what kind of file it was. And then we can put some tags in, which is some descriptive metadata. So metadata is kind of everywhere, and if you just kind of take a look and you see things that say like tags or file name, description, even Facebook has metadata when we are working with images, right? It asks us like who's in it and things like that. All of that information falls into that category. Of course, our data is used by our library-related systems, which are often baked into our websites. And this is what we've already mentioned, the ILS part of it, but this is what we call an integrated library system. So we search and we get something. And this is all built upon the data that we create. You may work in a shared database like WorldCat OCLC and then add your records to your ILS, or you may work directly with your ILS. There's multiple ways of doing this, but the work is very much the same across libraries. There are some libraries that put a customized library search engine on top of everything that searches all websites, all your resources. That's called a discovery layer. What that really means for cataloging is sometimes your work is hidden completely from the public, but our work is very much part of what they're accessing. So a bibliographic record contains the data elements necessary to help our users identify and retrieve a resource, as well as additional supporting information presented in a formalized bibliographic format. This is from Wikipedia. This gets right to our user task, right? A bibliographic record contains the data elements, and that's what we're about to look at next, our data elements necessary to help our users identify and retrieve, there's those verb or user task, that resource. So how do we, now that we understand a little bit about cataloging, how do we actually catalog? Well, you're going to need the resource itself, and this could be a surrogate, like a scanned copy. So if you're working on a photograph, you may have a scanned copy of your photograph, you may have a PDF of a thesis or dissertation or faculty paper, you may have a book, you may have a DVD, so you'll need that resource. That's the first thing. Resources usually come to us though, right? We usually don't have to go looking too hard for resources. And then you'll need access and permission to add or edit in your ILS. And this is something that would be between you and your systems person. And this is wherever you're going to store your records. It could be an institutional repository, it could be a digital archive, it could be your website, it could be one of these vendor softwares out there. OCLC, and we'll talk a little bit more about OCLC in part 2 in terms of how to actually work in OCLC, but OCLC is where you set your holdings, which tells other libraries whether or not you own a title. And so that means for ILL purposes, if you participate in OCLC, you can ILL through your networks, but you can't do that if you don't participate in the OCLC program and you set your holdings saying, yes, we own this. And then also, of course, that can be where you can get records to share or, copy catalog. You'll need some guidelines or standards for what you're going to do. These guidelines can be RDA. They can be national or local policies. You may have regional or consortial policies or best practices. MARC, certainly, most of us are still working in MARC, subject headings lists, things like that. And then if a physical item, you're going to need to know what will you need to physically organize it. Are you going to need call number labels? What is your call number scheme going to be? You probably know this already. You probably know if you're a Library of Congress, if you have Library of Congress call numbers or Dewey call numbers. You probably know if you have some materials that get their own local call number. So maybe you just shelve, maybe you just shelve DVDs, DVD 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. You would know that. And if you don't know that, that's something you should be able to at least see from looking in your library to see how materials are organized. If you get some new kind of material in your library or a new collection, this may be a decision that you have to make as part of deciding how to catalog these. We just got donated a collection of book plates from one of our local librarians. And they're beautiful, historic, lovely book plates. These are archival quality things we want to keep. Once we catalog them, how are we going to organize or classify them on the shelf? Are they going to be their own collection? Are we going to put them into special collections? Are we going to put them into some kind of container and let people check them out? That part of it is between you and your library, kind of. And we talked about this already, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but for many libraries, a library title is made up of 3 parts: that bibliographic record, and that would be your manifestation in that WMI model, that manifestation level record. But remember, we have to put everything in there because we don't have the other levels. That's where we describe our item, describe our resource. A holdings record, which describes where it's housed. And then an item record, sometimes referred to as a piece record, barcode record, that represents the individual item. So let's look at some examples. Let's talk about MARC now. So I already talked about this a little bit, but MARC has been around since the 1960s. Yes, people, the 1960s. We should all be really proud of MARC because I can't think of any piece of technology from the 1960s that is used as much as MARC is used today. Maybe some of your programmer friends know of something else, but I have not come across anything from talking to people I know who do programming where there's any piece of software from the 1960s, any piece of coding from the 1960s that's still being used every day actively. And MARC is being used every day actively by our libraries. So kudos to us for having something that's lasted so long. And mostly served us well, right? It is increasingly becoming outdated, though. And one of the problems that we are finding with MARC is that it just doesn't fit as well with our digital content or our websites. So, you know, Google has a really hard time indexing a MARC record unless our system does something to make that MARC record more understandable to Google. So our ILSs these days have to do a lot of work on the back end that we never see with the MARC record to make it more presentable to our users and patrons, and to do things like pull in book covers and, you know, make it look better, give them more information that we can't give them in a MARC record. So our systems have to do a whole lot of work because of a MARC record, because it's not built for digital content or websites, because hello, 1960s, those things did not exist. We still work in MARC, but we are starting to plan. So we're starting to look at what is going to be post-MARC cataloging. And so if you're really interested in like where we're going in the future, take a look at some BibFrame kind of stuff, because that's one of the things we're looking at as a potential down the road. Now, it's going to be a long time. I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb here and say it's going to be a long time before we move to BibFrame as a whole, because our vendors that create our catalogs, and as well as us in OCLC, we're all heavily invested in MARC records right now. So, you know, the developers still have to deal with it. We're still dealing with it, and you're still dealing with it, and it's a little bit of a headache. But we are looking at where we might go in the future. So if you're interested in that, check out some BibFrame stuff, because that's one of the things we're looking at. There's an example of a MARC field. This will give you an idea of why this is so complex. Every MARC field has 3 digits, and it's a range, so 200 to 299. And so if you know anything about like old school programming, the 0, the 1 kind of thing, digits and positions, that's what MARC is built on. We don't dig too much around in like that digit position part of it, but it is very much the actual structure of what the MARC format itself is built on. So we have a MARC tag that's a number, and that number is actually defined to mean something. So the 2XX range, that would be from 200 to 299, that's all related to the title. It does not mean anything else. And there is a list that we have to choose off of. So in some ways it is like a controlled vocabulary, but it's a controlled vocabulary of programming codes that we have to choose off. It has to mean exactly what we have selected. So the 245, that means it is the title field. It doesn't mean anything else. That's all it can mean, the title field. Now we have other title fields, and we'll look at a couple examples of those, but in terms of the primary title field, that is the 245. Then we have, after that 3-digit little sequence there, then we have 2 places for what is called indicators. First indicator, second indicator. These are by position. First indicator, first position. Second indicator has the second position. The indicators tell our system and communicate additional information. This is for the machine. And you remember, like in the old days with the 0, 1s, if you are familiar with any of that coding where things were either on or off, a lot of times that is how these indicators work. And they are very specific to each MARC field. So they are, again, defined in our MARC manuals. So we don't just choose what goes there for the most part. There's a couple where you get to choose, but for the most part, they're defined. First indicator, second indicator. Then we have our content or our text. This is what we actually write in based upon what we see on our piece. So the title of this is Calm Energy, and then there's a secondary or a subtitle or remainder of the title called How People Regulate Mood with Food and Exercise. So we've broken that out. There is then what's called a delimiter, and the delimiter is actually a little coding symbol that marks the end of one field and starts the subfield. So, you know, we have a MARC field here, 245, and then we have a sub field. So within that field, we are breaking it down a little bit more, and in this case, it's a B. There is actually a subfield A, but it is hidden in most systems. So you will see it sometimes when you look at MARC records. Other times you look at MARC records, you will not see a subfield A at all. It is always there. Whether or not you have to, if you're doing original cataloging, whether or not you have to put in that subfield A will depend upon your system. But it is there even if you don't input it. So subfield A is always the first, and then after that it varies greatly. So you have to follow what's in the list. And then we have a slash. So you see this punctuation here, the colon, the slash. That's called ISBD punctuation. We're going to look at that in a minute, and I've given you a cheat sheet for it. And then subfield C. So we have our delimiter sign and our C. So you can see this is very structured MARC coding, and you may say, how can I possibly remember all this? You will remember some of it as you do a lot more cataloging. What I would say is I've given you a resource where you can just look up whatever you need to. Look it up. I've also given you a cheat sheet. So look it up in the MARC format manual I've given you called BIBS format, and then use my cheat sheet as you need to. So here's the example of what it looks like when you see it on the public side. And you remember I said our ILSs have to make things pretty, and they made the freedom of speech. So there's our title. They made that nice and big, kind of making that nice and bold. They put a little book jacket in there. They've taken our MARC, these MARC tags here, and they've turned it into, just language. So they didn't put title in there. They've just made title big to show it as a title, but then they have author listed here. So, in our example here, that'd be the subfield C. They've got our author listed. They've got other information listed, and they've kind of taken our MARC, all that MARC stuff we have to do, and they've made it look nice. And then I've also shown you a little bit between the difference between a bibliographic information, so that would be what we'd input, and then things like there's the holding record that has the call number and where it's located, and then there's information coming from the barcode. Another example here, this is kind of just really defining it out to show you exactly where the fields are located. So this is one thing that I would suggest that you do is take your ILS, find a record, and then see if you can find the MARC display of it. From your public interface, you may be able to do, it may be called MARC View, it may be called Technical Display. You may have to dig around. In one library, I had to go to More Information and then Technical Display to see the MARC record. But in a lot of systems, you can see the MARC record somehow. So if you can, look at the public display, how pretty it is, and then go look at the back end of it and then see, because in some cases they'll just separate information out. They've separated out description and table of contents into separate little tabs. There's also in this one a technical display right there, so that would be a way for me then to go see what the MARC fields look like, because looking at the public view and then looking at the MARC view will be very helpful. If you can't see the technical view from your public display, and you have access to the back end of your catalog or back end of your ILS, then you could also do the same thing. You could write down the information from your search in the public and then go look in the back end, or you could take something from the back end, write down your information, and then go look in the front end of it. But I would say spend some time, look at the front end of a display, and you can even do this, it doesn't have to be your library, it could be any library. Go pick a library that has a lot of books, and then just look at some of the differences between the technical display and the public display, because that will help you see a lot more of this MARC stuff too. So here's another, this is just a little snippet. So I kind of truncated it a little bit so you don't see everything, but that's what the MARC in this technical display, that's what the MARC field tag looks like. We'll see the fixed field stuff, and we're not going to talk too much about fixed fields until we get to OCLC next time, but that stuff is hard-coded up there at the top. And when you look at all this stuff up here, it's just code jargon, right? It doesn't make any sense to us. We can't read it and really see it. That is because this is really all for the machine. But we will talk about its relationship to some of this stuff down here too. So MARC fields are arranged 1XX refers to all potential fields between 100 and 199, and then MARC fields and subfields are defined by our MARC encoding standards. So this is something that sometimes you'll have a template that you may work with if you're doing original cataloging, and that template should have a lot of this information predefined. It may be that if you're working, in your ILS, you may sort of have to create the template, and you may have to sort of put in some of this stuff to begin with. Here's another example. This is from OCLC, and we're going to look at OCLC a lot next time. Fixed field stuff is all up here at the top. And if you can look around, actually I covered up the S. The S is right here. But there is information here that does correspond with some of the information that we provide here. And we'll talk more about this in week 2, but just sort of looking at what our records look like. And here's another example. So kind of looking at it a little bit more. This is the delimiters, and I already mentioned that, but they're our code markers for the subfields. So this is a very code-oriented thing, which feels a little different if you've done any kind of social media, blogging, or anything like this. We don't usually have to do the code when we're blogging or doing a Facebook post, right? But this is something that you have to do when you're creating these records. Even if you use a template, you're probably going to still have to add some fields. So I mentioned the subfield A already. In this case, you can see those subfield A's. So as I mentioned, it could be, it could be something that's hidden. Now in this field, in the 260 field, we see here the subfield B. The subfield B in the 260 or the 264 field is the publisher location. How do I know that? I know that because my MARC manual tells me that information goes there. Now you may, if you have looked at a lot of records, you may just be able to see some of this and automatically know what it is. So, but it is defined by a MARC manual. So even if you know a 260 or 264 is the location, publisher location first, publisher location, publisher, and then it's our date, you're going to see that, you're going to know that information anyway. And the information about the delimiter symbol can be represented by numerous signs. So it can be represented by any of those. It was a little bit of trivia. It's called a dias, and it was originally represented by the subtraction and division signs together, and it's considered to be a critical marks in manuscript. So the variation, the more modern representation that we use, it's called a double dagger, that combines the division and subtraction symbols. So there's some trivia you can give with everybody. So I mentioned earlier that indicators, those are that follow the characters, and these most often affect things like display and indexing and searching by computer. So in the case of the 245, the first indicator, the indicator 1, actually tells us whether or not there is a 100 field there. So this has a relationship to the field above it. It's one of the few indicator relationships in a record that has to do with what is happening with the field above it. So 245, first indicator 1 means that we have a 100 or a 110. It means something in the 1XX range. So there'd be most likely a 100. It could be a 110 or 111. But anyway, there would be a 100 or something up here like that. Then the second indicator is actually what's called the non-filing index indicators. And these actually tell the system, tell the computer, where does the title start? And this is one of the things for copy catalogers. This is an easy thing for you to check because it's a thing that people miss all the time, especially if they're doing some kind of automated generation of records. So we are literally counting how many spaces before that title actually starts. We don't want to start it with the, right? We're going to start it with broker. So we skip any initial articles plus the space. So we actually have to tell the computer at what space or position should you start indexing or searching the title. We don't want it to start with the, we want it to start with broker. And so since we want it to start with broker, that is skip 3 characters, T, H, E, and then we're going to skip for the blank space to find the first real word, in this case, broker. So that's a really easy thing for you to check. The is always going to be 4 characters. So that, you know, you can even, there's even a little cheat sheet thing you could probably come up with, but that's a really easy one to check, is that second indicator, because it always relates to where that title starts. If the title of this book was broker and it had no article, then it would be 0, because you would say start at B, start at the first real word. How do we know this? We know this because the MARC encoding standards, that manual, tells us to do this. We talked a little bit about ISBD. I've given you a cheat sheet in the resources, so I can't spend too much time talking about that because we have a lot more to cover. It's used to used to separate elements of description, perhaps celebrate them as well. And it's going away. So there's punctuation in all of our examples. Probably when you go look at various records, you'll see punctuation. Just recently, as in the last couple of months, there has been a proposal that was accepted to do away with punctuation. Now, does this mean you should not put punctuation in, like the period and the colon and the slash and all that stuff? I would say continue to follow the punctuation guidelines for now, because your ILS may do something really funky if you don't punctuate properly, because right now they're still expecting to see that punctuation. But it would be something for those of you who are doing a lot of original cataloging and maybe working closely with your vendor. There may not be any of you doing that, but if you are, then it may be something to take a look at. Do we need to continue to support adding this punctuation? For those of you who are copy cataloging, I would say leave the punctuation as it is. If you find a record in OCLC that does not have punctuation, then my feeling would be go ahead and add it in. Or find another record if you can. There are not very many libraries. I've only heard of a couple of libraries who are sort of testing eliminating the punctuation, and even the big libraries I know are still doing punctuation. So people are talking about it, but there's not been any move or directive to get rid of it yet. So like I said, this was just accepted in the last couple of months. So for those of you who are copy cataloging, you may, probably not, but you might find a record that does not have punctuation. If you do, then my suggestion would be go ahead and put it back in. And I've given you a cheat sheet that should help you with that. OPACs, we're going to kind of skip through some of these examples, but it does explain what we put into our records do impact what information is displayed in terms of what the public sees, and then also indexing, whether or not it's searched. So MARC helps facilitate not only the search process with our users in terms of whether or not they can find what they're looking for, but whether or not it even is searched at all. So it is, and then also the priority in terms of where it's searched. So it's, you know, our work really does put a lot into that. Here's the MARC cheat sheet. I've given you another copy of this in your resource. For those of you who are copy cataloging, this can be a really useful resource to just kind of have as a checklist. So don't worry about printing it out from the slide, because you'll have it in the resources. And we're not going to go through every single one of these today, but we'll go through as many of as we can. 1XX, or what would usually most often be a 100 field, but it could be a 110 or it could be a 111. This is whether or not there's at least one person or corporate entity, what's called a corporate body. And corporate body has nothing to do with whether or not a group makes money. It's I think a real outdated term at this point. I hope it goes away soon. But it just means a group of people who work together, who are creating something together. This could be meetings, it could be conferences, it could be Lollapalooza. You know, it's any group of people who are working together. And this would be who is listed as the creator of the work. So if you have someone or an institution that's listed as the creator of the work, then there should be that matching 1XX field for that one. And we already talked about how the 1XX impacts the coding of the 245 first indicator. So this also impacts the findability and display to depend upon the system. So an example, me, 100 field, since I'm a person, I'm a 100. that would be first indicator 1 because my name is in that order. So that indicator actually has to do with, for the 1XX fields, actually has to do with what order and how they're actually written. And that information of how it's written comes from the authority file. So we'll look more at authority information in part 2. So this is called an authorized access point. We used to call these main entry a long time ago, but basically this is our creators. This is the primary person or group who has the intellectual, artistic, or creative responsibility for the content. So on a title page of a book, this would be the first person listed as by. So if it said by and then that first person listed, that would be who it was. If it said, doesn't have to say by, but whoever's listed first would be that primary person. So 100 is a personal name. That's me, like me. 110 would be that corporate name. Corporate name could be anything like United States Congress, Senate, Committee on Foreign Relations. Conference meeting, name, 111, 130, uniform title. If you have a 245 with the first indicator 0, that means there is no person listed, and that would mean you would have no one in that subfield C of your 245. You'd have no creator associated with this. How do you know how to record that information in this 100 or 110 field? You follow what it says in the authority record. So if I write a book and you get it from me and it says by Robin Fay, and then you go look up in the authority record and you see that my name is Fay Robin M, according to my official form of my name, then you would record it as Fay Robin M in the 100 field. And then in our 245, where you're going to record the by, you would just record it as it appears on that particular item. So it'd say by Robin Fay. So 245 is required for all fields, so for all records. So if you look into any OCLC record, you may see records that are very skeletal that don't have much. It should have a 245 at least. If you're copy cataloging and the only record you have to find that you can find that matches your item is very skeletal and has a 245, you can use that record, but I would highly recommend that you add to it and you finish out the cataloging as much as you can. If you don't put subjects in it, your patrons aren't going to be able to find it through subjects. If you don't explain how big it is, then it's going to be hard for people to kind of figure out on the shelf what it looks like and things like that. So we already talked about the indicators, but I've given them here to use kind of a cheat sheet. 0 if there's no 1XX field, 1 if a 1XX is present, and then that second indicator is where we are going to count over for the articles. We only count over for the articles. So it's 0 if there are no articles in front of the title. If there is an article, if it's a broker, that would be 2. A space over broker. Actually, wait, a space over broker, that'd be 3. So we have to count over including the spaces. The text is transcription. So for those of you who are copy cataloging, the text should match exactly what you see on the piece. Should match exactly what you see. If it does not, you need to look very carefully at the rest of your record. For you, those of you original cataloging, record it as you see it. Record it as it appears on your item. We talked about the MARC position already, and I just wanted to show you a little bit about what that looks like. So there's our 1-4, showing that we're going to count over for broker. We want the system to start indexing at broker. The 246 is the variant form of a title. This is where we can add a note or another title, and a note is necessary if an explanation is necessary. So if you have some information that appears like maybe on the book jacket, the title in the book jacket is different than what's on the actual book, what's on the title page, or the title and the spine is different than what's on the title page. I would record both. Use your title page as your primary because your title page is your primary preferred source. Use that and then add a 246 for your spine title, for your book jacket, whatever other titles may be there. Because if some library keeps the book jacket on their work, and doesn't just discard it, or maybe you're going to keep the book jacket on your work and you're not going to discard the book jacket, then what's on the title page is not going to match what's on your book jacket. And that's going to be maybe confusing to people. We do have a field where we can record those other variations. It's also a place where we can record for published typos. So under RDA, this is a change from what we did in the olden days. Under RDA, we record the title exactly as it appears on the piece. So if there is a misspelling on that title page, and you know for a fact everything else, the cover, book jacket, they all have the correct title, the title page is wrong, you would record the title for a book. You would record the title page as the title appears incorrectly. Then you would add a 246 to give the correct title that appears. And you could also, there's also a indicator that you can add in that will allow you to say like spine title. It'll automatically give that information, that note to a person. The other thing I would add is that you can then add a 500 note. So a note is necessary. That can be very helpful for people to know where that secondary title appeared. So my suggestion is always, when you add a 246, go ahead and add a 500 note and tell people where you found the information. The 500 note is a notes field, and you can kind of add whatever you want there. So you can say title on spine, you know, however you may want to say it. Serials follows the opposite approach if only one issue has a typo. This is a very rare situation, but you will occasionally see things with typos. So if a serial has only one issue that has a typo, and the serial itself, the rest of it stays the same, then you would continue to record the serial correctly as it's been for all these years. You wouldn't change it because of one issue, but then you would add a 246 for the issue that has the incorrect title, and then you would add a 500 note to explain volume 1 number 3 is the Brook House. You can with serials also, you might need to think about whether or not the title is actually changing and it's not a typo, but that's something you would kind of do as you're looking at it. So where to find information? Title page verso, that is the back of the title page. Sometimes you'll see TP or TP verso, that's the title page and that's the back of it. And then your chief source or your preferred source. This is the most important piece of it for cataloging. This is both for copy and original cataloging. You're going to look at the title page, which is the first page in the book, usually, but not always, but you'll know the title page when you get to it. And then you're going to look at the back of it. That's considered your preferred source. That is your first choice. You can secondly then look at the cover, the book jacket. Sometimes you have other title pages stuck in there, like for series and stuff. You may have a preface. You know, you may have a foreword from the author that tells you information. You can look anywhere for other information. Anytime you're getting a title from any place other than the title page or the back of the title page, because that's the preferred source. So any resource that's not the preferred source, you're going to put that 500 note to explain where you got your title from. Title from book jacket. And if you have multiple titles, that's where you're going to add your 246 if they're different. So if the spine, you know, sometimes people shorten things on the spine to get it all to fit on that spine. If you have multiple things there, then you're going to do a 246, but you'll have to choose what your primary is first, which for books, your primary is your title page. If you need to construct a title, for those of you doing photographs and things like that, you can put it in brackets. Photograph of, in brackets, what it is. For movies, your preferred source is always your title screen. Yes, the title screen. Secondary is the credits. The container is not your first choice. I know you're all groaning. I hear you. I hear you. I hear you. The container is not the first choice. So for those of you who are copy cataloging, in theory, the information in the title should come from the title screen. The problem is nobody wants to do this, or few people want to do this. So it's a lot of time to sit down and actually watch the movie for the first few minutes and jot down things from the title screen. Same thing with the credits. You have to, you know, sit down and do it. You may not have the player, you may not have access, whatever. So many times catalogers shortcut and go to the container. I understand why the choice, this is stated in our guidelines, by the way, so this is not something I'm making up and imposing on you. It is because we're looking at the information that is actually on the item itself. So for the book, where is the item itself? The guts of your book. That is your title page. It's not the cover, it's not the book jacket that might fall off. Those are all secondary resources. You can use them, but you need to give a 246 then to explain it. And you need to give those multiple titles if you have other options. Same thing for movies. The item itself, the official record of that particular DVD is the title screen, because boxes vary. And if you've cataloged movies, you know this, boxes vary. So, but the problem is, because this is challenging to do, and especially when you're copy cataloging, you don't have a whole lot of time, you got a whole bunch of movies, you know, we just, so many times people just kind of shortcut, and even in original cataloging, when they should be looking at the title screen, they don't always do it. So the container is not your first choice. My suggestion would be, if you're original cataloging and you need to use the container, then use a 500 note to explain that you're using the container and that you're cataloging from the container and not the title. Because then the person who comes along to copy catalog, if their container differs, they will at least know that you cataloged from the container and not from the title screen. So maybe that's where the discrepancy is. For those of you who are copy cataloging, I would say if what matches in the title and all the rest of the record matches your DVD, then I don't see a reason for you to have to pop the DVD and play it. If you have significant differences and you cannot find a matching record that matches your actual version, then at that point I think you're going to have to pop it into a DVD player and actually take a few minutes to look at it. And hey, maybe you'll get to watch the next Marvel movie for a few minutes. For websites, databases, this is the home page, and then secondary, the about page. And for websites, you're always going to explain where you access the information for the title, and then also when, because of course websites change. You can consider using any supporting resource to catalog a resource, but once you get outside the item itself, you're going to add those notes. A couple of notes about CIP. This is cataloging in publication, aka CIP data. It is a bibliographic record prepared by a Library of Congress or a librarian on behalf, a cataloger on behalf of the Library of Congress, for a book that has not yet been published. Having been part of this program, I can tell you one of the things that happens all the time is they give you information, the publisher gives you information, especially for children's book, and they give you the illustrator as the author. So they don't give you the author, they give you the illustrator. And so you catalog the illustrator as the author, and then lo and behold, what happens? One of you buy the book, and then you're like, why is that record wrong? Well, it's because we didn't get the right information. So CIP, you can look at CIP, by all means, take a look at it, but do not consider it to be set in stone. This is also why there's no information about the pagination or how big it is, because we have no idea what size the thing will be. We often do not know if it's going to be illustrated, except for children's books. We usually at least know that, but for other books, we just don't know it. So, we are getting this information based upon the publisher. And so what happens is the publisher sends the cataloger group doing these records information. The cataloger creates the information, creates the record in OCLC. The information goes back to the publisher, and the publisher prints that cataloger's information in the book. And then, lo and behold, the book cover may change or the book title may change. So just don't assume it's correct. We're going to skate through some of these pretty quickly. 250 is our edition statement. It's transcription, so it appears as it appears on the piece. It should match if it has one. And we will talk more about editions a lot next time. So if it does not appear on the resource, but you know it is an edition, you can supply that information. If supplied, you add the brackets, and again, you add that note to explain where you got that information from. So, anytime you are adding information about the resource itself that is coming from a source outside the item itself, go ahead and add that 500 note. There is no limit to 500 notes, and nobody's going to go you shouldn't have added that 500 note. Instead, some cataloger, especially some copy cataloger or someone who has to order, who's in a hurry, is going to be very thankful to see that note because it's going to explain why there's that difference. 260, they're still acceptable, but they're quickly becoming obsolete. So if you're doing original cataloging, please look to using the 264s. There are multiple fields. We're expanding what we can talk about with publication, so we can also talk about distribution and manufacture. So um, things like all of those record collections that come out, and I think Columbia House records are long gone these days, but all those things that are manufactured by a particular organization, we can actually record that information now. There is information that is listed in the MARC manual, which I've given you in the resource, and the 264 is defined by indicators depending upon the type of publication information. Is it a distribution, or is it a manufacturer, or is it a publication or a copyright? The fields are all repeatable, and you can have multiple 264s. If you have missing information, in the olden days we used to use Latin to kind of say like, hey, this we don't know. Now we can say things like place of publication not identified, publisher not identified, date of publication not identified, or if you have a good idea. Like I know this was Georgia State University Library's publication because it was their committee, right? So I know their committee did these committee papers, and they're at Georgia State University Library, and that's in Atlanta, Georgia. So I've got a pretty good idea, and it covers the date range. It's the committee meetings from 2013. So I'm pretty sure that they would have done those committee meetings in 2013. So if you can make a good educated guess, go ahead and do it. Just question mark it. If you can't, then you can do this place of publication not identified. We're leaning towards if you can make an educated guess and you feel comfortable in that, go ahead and do it and at least put a question mark. If you can determine the information definitively, Georgia State University Library, I know it was published there, then you could go ahead and just bracket that, but you don't have to question it because you know this committee was there. Some examples, and I'll give you more examples. We'll look at more examples next time too. All of this gives us a lot more flexibility when we're searching because we can look at dates. We will look next time more at dates because we're going to talk about dates as the relationship between the fixed field and the 264 as well as the end of the call number. So we'll talk about all of those relationships when we're looking at OCLC records next time. AACR2, which was our older rules, used a lot of abbreviations. The only abbreviations in RDA are things that are already abbreviated or units of measurements. So centimeter is abbreviated because it's a unit of measurement. Inches, abbreviated, unit of measurement. Pages is not a unit of measurement. So pages is not abbreviated, but inches would be, or centimeters would be. We have some newish MARC fields, and we'll talk and look at a lot more of these in the next coming session. These are things we are going to pick from a list or a controlled vocabulary. I have also given you a cheat sheet that you can look at. All records should have a 336, 337, and 338. These fields are repeatable, but they should have at least one of each of those. If you are recording movies or recording sound things, if you're recording IMAX, then you would have some other fields that you could put in. If you are recording those resources, and I will actually put some good record examples into your folder to look at too, so you'll have those, then that would be something to look at. So olden days, we had this thing called the GMD, which was in a subfield H in the 245. That is completely obsolete. OCLC has removed them all. If you still have any in your system, it would be a decision for you to decide, do I want to remove them? Do I want to convert them? I know some systems are not working very well with the new fields, so that might be something to look at in your community too, because this gives us a lot more flexibility. So instead of for a DVD, we just had video recording, we have two-dimensional moving image, video, and video disc. So we have a lot more information. We have information about what kind of device you need to use. In the case of print, that's unmediated, you don't need a device. And then we have information about the container, and then we have information about what it actually is. So for books, we have information about it being text, we have information about it being print or unmediated, and then we have information about the volume. We've already talked about 500 notes a lot, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about it as we wrap up here, but there's so many notes you can use. Please use notes, especially if you have to pull some information from someplace else. Use a note. So lots of notes. You can use so many notes. Do them. We've already talked about LC subject analysis, but I wanted to give you a little workflow here, but we really are looking at what the work is about as a whole, and then we're looking at finding that appropriate subject heading in our thesaurus, and that could be Library of Congress subject headings, might be MESH, the medical subject headings, it might even be Dewey or Sears. It could be any of those, or it may be some local controlled vocabulary you're using entirely, and that gets coded in a completely different field. But we really go through the process of looking at what those subject headings are, making sure that they're precise, and then once we get them as precise as we can, we try to get as granular as we can, then we look to see whether or not we can add anything more to them. So the order of subject headings, the first subject heading reflects the primary topic or focus of the work, and this generally corresponds to the assigned call number. We are going to talk so much about call numbers in part 2, so do not fear that we're not going to talk about them, because we will. Other headings should follow in descending order of importance, and then that first subject heading is really linked to the classification or the call number if you're using LC or Dewey. So we will talk and look a lot at those examples. You can look all of this up in that MARC manual I've given you, the bibliographic formats and standards. It will actually go through and tell you all of this. I actually copied and pasted it right from that, so do not fear that you will not have this information available to you. So as we see here, 650, topical, so that means it's a subject, and we have here first indicator. First indicator is blank. Pound sign means blank, means nothing there. First indicator, we're putting nothing in there. Second indicator, subject authority for entry. This is what vocabulary you're using. And you know, there's a list. You pick off the list. If you are using something that is not on this list, you are not going to use the 650. These 650 for subjects have only been defined for the Library of Congress, the Library of Congress Children's Literature, and the National Library of Medicine, and then Sears. That's only choices you can make here. So if it's not on the list for the indicators, then you're going to use a different field. The 600 range, so 6XX, 600 to 699 is for all different kinds of subjects. So there are places you can put your own local thesaurus, but it won't be in a 650 field. So that's the other thing too. When you're doing original cataloging, you're starting to do original cataloging, as you kind of work your way down the MARC record and you're looking at the kinds of things you need to include, make sure you're choosing the appropriate fields. As you get more experience, of course, you will become familiar with this. We're going to talk a lot more about subjects next time as well, but these are just some examples to look at. Notice our subfield A, you know, that subfield A that I said was hidden is hidden in all of these examples. All of these subfields are defined according to our MARC manual. So that's one of the things, especially when you're a new cataloger, like I said, it's really good practice to look in the public display and then look behind the scenes to take a look at it and see how things fit together. Another thing that we're starting to use a little bit more is we're creating some genre terms. And so this genre terms are what a work is versus what a work is about. So a subject heading, any of those subject heading kinds of things, what a work is about. The genre tells us what a work is. Is this a film noir? Is it a cartoon? Is it a topographic map? There is something in subjects. And let's see, do we have one here? Yes, we have here at the bottom, exhibitions. So before we came up with genres, so they haven't been around for too long, and in fact the list is still growing and growing and growing. Before we came up with genres, we did what was called form subdivisions, and these are a subfield V. And there are lists, again, that you pick off of that you can add to some subjects. So we're trying to do this. And in recent years, we've decided that we'd rather have our own field to define what an item is versus what an item is about. And so we're moving slowly to less of the subfield V and more of the 655. So there is some overlap between these two. The other place, when we were looking at all those different people, we were talking about, like, we have the primary author, creator, and then we have all those other people. All those other people go into a 7XX field. So if they're a person, they go into 700. It matches what's for the 1XX field. So remember, 100 would be if I wrote a book, then Faye, Robin M would be the 100. If I co-author a book, and I'm not the primary author, I'm not the first one listed on the title page, then I would go in the 700 field, and I would be, again, Faye, Robin M. So what would be recorded in that subfield C? What's recorded in the subfield C of the 245 for the authors? You know, it might say like Michael Soares and Robin Faye. Then Michael would get the 100 field, and I would be in the 700 field, and, you know, that just be kind of how it goes. The indicators and subfields in each of these fields are the same as the indicators and subfields in the corresponding 1XX fields. So what do you have to catalog? How do you know? We're going to kind of really blaze through these because I know we're running over a little bit. So we have finite resources, and we'll talk more about these in the upcoming week. And these would be where we have something that's more static, and this would be where we have monographs and things like that. We are starting to look more about how this division happens, and where multi-part things, if they're issued over multiple years, may be shifting into a new category. And remember when I was talking about the LRM was going to really impact how we thought about dates and things that were multi-parts. This is a wonderful slide for now, but I think we're going to see some shift in terms of those multi-parts and serials. So this is a really great diagram to look at least for the next little bit, a couple of years maybe. I'm not sure how far out we can go with this, in terms of looking at what do I have? Do I have something where the parts remain discrete? And where would that fit my item? Or do I have things that do not remain discrete, where they integrate into things? And that websites also fall into this category. So a monograph, a title which is published as a unique finite work. I think most of us recognize a monograph or a book. They can be electronic or traditional print, and these works may be considered static, so, you know, they don't continue on. There are occasionally some sets that continue on, but they're meant, the difference between a monographic set and a serial is a monographic set is meant to actually end. The publisher knows in 25 volumes this will be done. This is a 25 volume collection. There's something about it to tell you that. And we're going to talk more about this distinction with looking at all those different issues and things like that in part 2, when we really delve into specific situations. So for the purposes of cataloging, this is any non-serial publication in one volume or intended to be complete. That's really the big part of it. Serials, this is everything from newspapers to journals to things like Teen Superstars. These are a title, and it's issued in discrete parts, and they may have volume and numbering, or they may not. And they often have numbering, but they really do not always. But they have no finite ending and date. So we do know serials go away, right? I don't think Teen Superstars is even around anymore. But the original intent was it was meant to go on forever. They're diachronic, meaning they're published over time. And these are really easy examples of serials that I've given you here. You know, the title stays the same from issue to issue. They have volume numbering, all that kind of thing. In part 2, we're really going to dig into some of the things that are a little bit more confusing and questionable in terms of what kind of treatment they are. Media, we've already talked a lot about media in terms of movies and things like that. That's really anything, audio, CDs, DVDs, Laserdisc, any formats of material that really falls into that media category, and this includes streaming stuff as well. And RDA, those new fields we just looked at very, very briefly, these are helps us better categorize media and other types of material that we've looked at. Integrating resource. This is a resource that is added to or changed by means of updates that do not remain discrete, so you can't tell where the changes happen really. Websites and databases are examples of this type of a resource. And we're going to kind of skip through our examples because we've already looked at them. And finally, to finish up, where to get your resources. So where to get your records. WorldCat, OCLC, and you may use Connection either as a web browser or you may use Connection that you download. It is something that you have to pay for access to. So if you don't have paid access to get records, then where can you get records from? You can get records from the Library of Congress online catalog. You may be able to get a record from any library that has a downloadable record. And of course, vendors will often send us records, so you can get records in that way. Briefly, and we've talked all about this, but we haven't really kind of defined it. What makes for a match? Any record should match on the field's value, which you can compare to the item that you have in hand. And this includes the 245, it includes the authors, it includes the date of publication, it includes the physical description and specific information such as edition, language, or series. Transcription fields should match. Your 245 should match. Your publication information should match. Your edition information should match exactly what's on your piece. If it does not, that's the decision where you need to look you may need to look for other records to see whether or not there is a better match. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's a better match in part 2. But one of the things you're looking at in a better match would be, do you have a complete record? You know, when you look at multiple records out there, is the record that you are looking at potentially choosing that matches? Have you picked the best record? And in part 2 of this, we will talk more about searching in OCLC, and we'll actually look at that process a little bit. So I'll give you some tips for reducing the number of searches that you return when you're searching. So make sure that you're looking for matches. And if you don't have a match, then things you'll need to determine is whether or not, if you can originally catalog in OCLC, do you need to input a new record? And if you can't originally catalog in OCLC, then should you just create a record locally so that you can at least have a record of that item? So we will talk about that in part 2, and we will also go through some of those issues that you may encounter in terms of the serials and monos and things like that. I've given you a lot of resources. I'm going to put some more examples in this afternoon. And so do take a look at all my handouts and cheat sheets. OCLC WorldCat has a lot of help. If you want to actually go through a MARC tutorial, there is one on the OCLC website you can do that's really good. There's a lot of help with Connection on the which is the technical module WorldCat. There's listservs, there's cataloging, training, and workshops through all different kinds of things, including Cephalin. Many listservs and tutorials and places for you to be able to participate. And on that note, thank you so much for sticking with me, and sorry that we had a little bit of a technical issue there. And let's see. So Pam had a question about where are these notes? Yes, the handouts should be attached to your email, and there's actually a folder that's been created that has a lot more beyond what's even on that list. And even on the folder, there's like a resources link that'll take you to more. So there's a lot of resources listed on that folder. So if you follow the link, it actually takes you to a Google folder. And when you open that Google folder, you'll see some exercises quizzes, you'll see the presentation slides, you'll see a little bit of everything in there. So lots and lots of resources in there. And I'm going to add some more record examples in there. Thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you in part 2. In part 2, we will cover really searching in OCLC, how to define your searches to reduce the amount of records you get and hopefully give you better quality records. And we'll talk through the actual process of looking at match points in OCLC, and then we'll talk about some of those very specific issues between that serial and monos and how do you make those decisions. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next time.